guys, what's going on? So today I'm really excited because on the show we've got Dr. Andy Galpin, and he's going to be talking to us about optimizing muscle growth for powerlifters. So Andy, first off, thanks so much for coming on the show. I've been following you for a long time. You've been putting out some really amazing content, both on YouTube with your 5-minute, 25-minute physiology, a lot of the articles and the podcasts that you've been doing. So can you give the listeners a little bit of background about yourself and kind of what you've been involved in?
Yeah, sure. I'm a professor at Cal State Fullerton, and I'm also the director of the Center for Sport Performance out here. So one part sports scientist, if you will. We study in our center, we have everything under the umbrella of biomechanics, also physiology. We do a little nutrition stuff, sports psychology, kind of a whole host of different things that would fall under, that general umbrella, strength and conditioning. I teach in the areas of graduates, and senior level sports nutrition, program design, basic strength and conditioning things, kind of strength and conditioning version of physiology. And then on the side of that, I work with professional athletes kind of on all things human performance. And so these are mostly combat sport athletes. So a lot of UFC fighters, wrestlers, boxers, things like that, some Major League Baseball players, and some handful of other things on the outside. So that's generally what occupies most of my day.
That's awesome. And so you've done quite a bit of research. I saw you were doing some research with, I'm not sure if this came out of your lab or if it was just one of your colleagues. It was a while back on like trans athletes. And I think you were doing some work on enhanced athletes as well. And so there's been a lot of really cool things that have actually been coming out of your lab that it's been really interesting to watch. So I'm really glad that we've got you here actually to kind of chat about some of these things.
Yeah, for sure. Let's do it.
So let's just start off with, can you kind of give a general overview of, some of the more primary mechanisms of muscle hypertrophy and somewhat of a relative breakdown of their hierarchical order?
So the starting place for all this conversation was probably in due credit to Brad Schoenfeld, and he published a nice review article. It's probably been 8 years or more.
Was it a 2011 paper?
Something like that, yeah. And I think it's called the mechanism of muscle hypertrophy, or the 3 mechanisms or something. In that, he's the first to really speculate that there's really 3 likely causes or ways you can induce it. So very quickly, one of them would be mechanical tension. So you can think of this as like lifting heavy, if you will. So the muscle itself has to contract with a lot of force. Number 2 being metabolic disturbances or metabolic damage, if you will, metabolic disruption, however you want to think about it. But this is the burn, right? This is something where you feel like, oh my gosh, I'm doing a lot of reps and I feel a metabolic thing. It's not necessarily heavy per se, but you would feel the burn. And then the 3 would be actually muscle damage itself. And so at the time, most of that was speculative, and we didn't know a lot about the mechanisms. And muscle damage is exactly what you think it would be, right? And so we didn't know many things about whether or not that those are even true. If so, do you need all 3? Do you need 1? Or is 1 sufficient? Do you need 2? And what's the best way to do that? And so all those questions weren't known at the time. Fast forward almost a decade later, and we do have a lot more answers in those areas. And so the way you can kind of think about this practically is, people who have done nothing but primarily heavy lifting. So this is probably, think of this in the case of a weightlifter, Olympic weightlifter, or a power lifter, and you're pretty much spending most of your time doing triples or lower, right? So you do some, of course, higher stuff, but for the most part, it's really, 1s, 2s, 3s, and 4s and 5s are even crazy. 8s and 10s are really rare in the program, and certainly almost nothing past that. But yet they tend to be very muscular if they spend that time, but they're not nearly as muscular as, say, someone who's focusing simply on aesthetics, right? And so clearly there's some hypertrophy there when they're not using the burn, the metabolic damage, the metabolic disturbance at all. They're not using a ton of muscle damage either, because the volumes are generally fairly low, but they're getting a lot of mechanical tension. And then if you can kind of work your way, and I can do it if you want, but you can work your way through the entire spectrum of going from, bodybuilder or weightlifters, powerlifters, kind of up to bodybuilders, then all the way through like CrossFit athletes and folks that are doing like 25s and 30s and reps to 40 all the way up. And then you can extend that all the way out to even things like blood flow restriction training. And that's fairly popular now, but at the time it wasn't. And so this is an instance where the load is almost nothing, right? So you're talking 30%, very, very, very light, if not less. And you can still see a reasonable amount of hypertrophy there. And so that would support the fact that mechanical tension wasn't necessarily needed, but the metabolic damage was enough to induce the same thing. And then you can kind of fill out that story by looking at the muscle damage picture. And when you see that there is some correlation between the amount of damage you get and the growth you get, but that correlation is very low, actually very weak. And so it's very clear that all three of these are possible, but not necessarily any one of them is mandatory to induce muscle growth. And so there's still a lot of questions we have, but at this point, the research is at a place where I can say it's probably fairly clear that the mechanical tension, so the heavy part, is probably, and I'll use a couple of qualifiers here, probably, mostly, definitely the most important of those two. So it's fairly clear at this point where, again, if muscle hypertrophy is just the only goal, you're not worried about getting stronger as well, or any of those things, if you're just trying to grow, but still mechanical tension reigns supreme. So call that, 50% or more of the pyramid, and then metabolic damage and muscle damage are much smaller up the pyramid, so they're relevant. And that's pretty clear. So that's a basic overview of the general mechanisms.
One thing that I always kind of found interesting was when that review paper came out, I don't know if it was like maybe 2018 or 2019, the Schoenfeld paper, when he was looking at like extremely high volumes with like as low as 30% load. It seemed like everyone's response was, see, you don't need any heavy weights. You can do this, you can do that. But to me, it seemed a little bit like, I don't know, it seemed a little bit preemptive, because at the same time, it's like, okay, sure. Well, in an acute sense, yes, the hypertrophy is going to be pretty similar, but I felt like the potentiation that you get from strength over the long term wasn't necessarily being like counted as significant. And in my opinion, anyways, that does seem to be something that I've noticed to be pretty important if you're looking for long-term hypertrophy gain. So could I kind of get you to speak on that side of things?
Yeah, so you also have to keep in mind, because you bring up another tangential point and I specifically said, like, this only counts for hypertrophy, right?
Yeah.
So in other words, if you look at the different training styles, well, it's very, very clear that the metabolic damage one, the burn, actually results in no strength gains typically. Mm-hmm. So you don't get any strength gains at all. And the muscle damage one, you might get some. So in one place, you're clearly getting basically none, but the mechanical tension, the heavy lifting, is actually really, really, really strongly correlated with, turns out, getting stronger, right? Shocking. So if you're trying to get strong and big, or at least you want some kind of increase in strength while you're doing it, then again, this is now just a clear case for mechanical tension being the thing there. And to bring it back to your point, what we don't have, and what we probably honestly never will have, is much knowledge past what happens after the first, say, 8 to 12 weeks of training. And this is what I think you're kind of alluding to, is sure, you might get an equal amount of growth in the first 8 weeks of training, especially if you're untrained or, lowly trained. No matter what you do, you'll probably be there. But what happens in the next 6 weeks or the next 6 years? Well, that's very, very different. And some of these studies have looked at somewhat well-trained individuals to kind of tease that out a little bit. But it's still pretty unclear, because even getting someone who's well-trained, and I've done a number of these studies, it's really, really difficult to get the same level of training. Even if you put in qualifiers like you have to squat this amount or you have to lift this, like, it's still really, really subjective, and really the groups vary quite a bit. And so we don't know the longer term implications. And so, because what you'll see a lot of times the bodybuilding community argue over are things like, well, I just focus on the things that drive hypertrophy. And then other folks say, no, actually, you need to send some of your phases getting really damn strong, because then when you go back to hypertrophy, you're able to do those sets at a much higher intensity, and that will actually, in the longer run, drive greater hypertrophy. And so those questions are somewhat unresolved scientifically, but I would actually hedge towards you on that one in saying that, yeah, like, just doing the one that only gets you some hypertrophy and compromises strength gains as a certain phase of your training, 6-week block here, or pre-competition, or whatever phase you want to do it in, that's fine. But if that's your general training approach, I think you're going to be missing the boat quite a bit on some potentially even hypertrophy, let alone strength gains.
What sort of variation would you, I guess, preference if the primary objective is performance in powerlifting? And I say variation from like a load, volume, exercise variation, all that sort of standpoint, like all inclusive.
Well, at this point, if you're talking specifically for powerlifting, I don't think that the science from our end is nearly as robust as what the practitioners would say. In other words, it's hard for me to argue based on the science we have available at this moment that we know much more about that specific question than what Louis Simmons would tell you. I mean, geez, if you, so my answer honestly would be like, well, probably listen to the people right now that have trained 50 people in that, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, we have some basic principles there, but really those folks, just to have, their evidence is better. Is the easiest way to put it. So I don't even want to really comment and give you specific examples because I don't coach powerlifters. I don't compete in it. And I mean, I could do it, but I'd just be regurgitating what all these other people say.
Right.
So.
Okay, awesome. So one thing that's always kind of interested me was kind of where people's caps are in terms of muscle growth. So, you know, everyone has kind of experienced that sort of like ceiling, whether it's genetic or whatever, where they just can't really seem to grow more muscle or grow more strength. So specifically when we're talking about muscle, why does that happen? Like what are the actual, I guess, physiological limitations that cause us to sort of slow down that process?
Yeah, actually, I would encourage you to take a look at and follow Kevin Murak, Murach, at the University of Kentucky in the muscle biology lab there. This is pretty much what he does. Jimmy Bagley as well at San Francisco, two great folks. So yeah, I mean, I could go through the basic background on what the current theories are if you'd like, but I'll jump straight to the answer by saying we still don't know, because even something that we thought was pretty clear a couple of years ago, the mononuclear domain theory, and Kevin has shown pretty clearly that's just not true. And so we're left kind of honestly back at square one being like, what the fuck? I don't know. We know some things are correlated, and it tends to be things like this, and this seems to be associated, but when you try to actually make that happen, and specifically, so you try to, I'll say this way, when you try to demonstrate direct causality, it just fails. And the other issue we have is, and sometimes it's appropriate to use mirroring models, and other ones it's not. In this particular case, when you take the human research and you compare that to the rat or the mouse research, it's not syncing up. So I'm just not sure at this point what relevance satellite cells, what relevance mononuclear AI have, even the role of, say, testosterone. Like all these things are clearly related somehow, and you can design a study where you show relationship, but again, showing like this goes up by 10, therefore your muscle increases by 10.
Right.
We're just nowhere near that. At best, it's like, you know, this goes up by 1,000, and then therefore your muscle goes up by 3. Like,
yeah.
Okay, they're related, great, but like, what happened to the other 997?
Yeah.
We don't know.
No, that makes sense. And that I would imagine that would be like pretty frustrating sometimes as a researcher, where you're like accumulating all this data, and then all of a sudden you're like, oh, well, turns out the last 5 years we were on the wrong track. Now time to pivot and go in another direction.
Well, it's honestly, it's not frustrating. It's always exciting, because when you do that, it's kind of like throwing away and cleaning out your garage.
Yeah.
It's cleansing, because you're like, oh, hey, okay, all this shit we gotta throw away. We don't have to worry about this. This doesn't occupy my brain anymore, because this is clearly not it. And that also, like when we go through things, and even when I write papers or speak on podcasts and stuff, I always do it with a bit of, well, like kind of it. And that's because I know whatever I think is even like solid right now, you know, could be 2 years. I come back and be like, yeah, now that turned out, it looks great at the time, but it's not actually what we think happens anymore. So that's just part of being a scientist. It's actually, you should be filled with less certainty than more. That's the whole point of science. So
actually, it was funny because there was I can't remember when it was published, but there was a paper that came out a while back that essentially looked at several PhDs, and they were looking at their level of confidence in predicting future outcomes or something like that for their athletes. And essentially, like, the more confident they were, the less ability they had to actually predict future outcomes. The less confident they were, the more precision they demonstrated. And I thought that was super interesting. And then it's also kind of goes hand in hand where, you know, anytime you're looking at an expert, they're always like, well, I don't know, it sort of seem like they're like fumbling if you don't really have any background in there, because there's like so much nuance. And then you
Yeah,
get
and it's
someone kind of
classic
speaking on
Dunning.
like six-pack shortcuts who's like, this is the way, eat
Yeah, I mean, it's
avocados and
classic.
you're going to get jacked.
It's Dunning-Kruger effect, right?
Yeah,
That's the
yeah,
best
totally.
explanation of it. But it's also, I typically find it's experience, right? So those that actually do it tend to have a lot less confidence, which
Mm-hmm.
sounds antithetical, but it's not, right? So if you're like, oh yeah, I did it one time with someone, or like I watched this guy on Instagram, or I heard this dude, his YouTube page, and he said this is how it works, and he's strong, whatever. But then when you actually do it and you put it in place, and you're like, wow, okay, 300 times it didn't work, and you have all this actual experience, you tend to be a lot less confident.
Mm-hmm.
As well as if you do that and you're considering other factors, if you're being closed to other factors, then you could be convinced and tricked that like this is always working, but it's probably not, right? So humans are complex. It's very difficult to pin things down to a one-to-one linear relationship.
And so one of the things that you mentioned earlier about muscle damage was um, that the relationship isn't necessarily like clear. Like it doesn't scale linearly, but then at the same time, there does seem to be like some correlation. So I guess like how I usually explain it to my athletes is like, especially newer ones, I'll kind of be like, look, if you're never sore and you're not growing, it probably means you're not working hard enough. But if you're growing, whether you're sore or not doesn't seem to really make a difference. You know, I'll kind of usually like give a caveat like that. Um, but I've heard you kind of explain it in a little bit of a different way, which sort of talking about like a point system almost. Can you explain like the acute relationship and how that kind of differs from like the chronic relationship or scaling linearly to actually seeing differences in muscle growth?
Yeah, honestly, it's six one way, half a dozen the other.
Mm-hmm.
You and I are saying the same thing. Basically, I use a different description, but it's identical in the fact that um, if you scaled yourself on a point system of 1 to 10, 10 being you're sore for a month and couldn't move, one being you didn't feel anything. If you're working out and you're in the ones and twos and threes, you're probably not going to be growing a whole lot. The inverse, if you're 8, 9, 10, and you're so sore that you have to take literally weeks off or a whole week off, well, that's actually going to bite you in the ass because you won't then be able to train as frequently. You'll have to take more time off. You'll go back and it's your day to work out and it's your time and you got childcare and you got off work and you're so damn sore you can't move. And so you have to do something else. Well, that actually hurt you quite a bit. And so there's actually a decent amount of research looking at what matters, total volume completed, or say breaking that volume in half and doing it more frequently, or maybe in this example, a third. So say you want to do 100 total sets in a week, 100 total reps. Is it better to get all those 100 done in a day and then just get brutally sore and recover as long as you can repeat that every 7 days, if you will? Or of those 100 repetitions, should you break it up and do 25, 25, 25, 25? And so you can look to that research to find your answers. Either one could possibly work, but generally when you factor in, when you take the science and say, okay, well, how does this scale to human life? Typically, if you're getting to those extreme levels of soreness, unless you're, really, really high level folks who like this is their whole life and you're that level of commitment. Outside of that, you probably should live in like the 4 to 7 range if you want to be able to train as frequently. Again, this is also assuming you have, or especially if you have more than one actual training goal. If your only goal is to grow muscle, and this is it, and you're in a bulking phase, it's a little bit different because you like say, okay, I'll do my quads on Monday, and you might work out tomorrow, but you're going to do triceps tomorrow, and you're going to do different muscle groups in a classic kind of like body part split. So by the time you get back to your quads, it might be 7 days anyways. Well, that's very, very, very different than, say, a power lifter who's like, yeah, I'm deadlifting Monday, and that's mostly my back, but your quads are still going because you're living heavy as hell. And then you go to squat on Thursday, and you're still wrecked sore. Well, that's going to absolutely compromise Thursday's training session. So you extend that to the athletes I work with, and it's like, you can't do quads on Monday because we use our quads every single day because we're moving, and no matter what we do training wise. So it doesn't work that way. I can't get them to that level of soreness because they're not going to have 6 days off before they use their tricep again, because they use all muscles all day or close to it. So it just depends on the outcome goal, the individual, and what you're going after. But yeah, typically, I don't like to see much more than 6 out of 10 in terms of soreness, depending on the phase. Certain phases of our training for our fighters, like, it's cool, and we'll get to even 8. That's fine. But most of the part, that number is going to get too high because you're just going to compromise training.
One thing that's kind of gained a lot of popularity is like fiber type specific hypertrophy. So
Yeah.
there was a paper recently by, I think it was this year actually, by Schoenfeld and colleagues, where they looked at high rep versus low rep and kind of looked at the soleus, which is predominantly slow twitch and things like that. And they didn't really seem to find a difference. And it seems anyways, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that the jury's still out. They don't necessarily know. But from the research that I've seen, it seems to sort of be leaning in the direction of not necessarily being overly relevant. Do you have any sort of experience in fiber type hypertrophy? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
So a couple of things that are extremely clear. Any general form of strength training will preferentially target fast twitch fibers, almost always, or switch. The question is there a repetition range within that paradigm that is then more fast twitch or slow twitch? So an example, if you were to jog for an hour, that's clearly going to be induce more hypertrophy, the slow twitch fibers, and induce fast twitch fibers, in part because many of the fast twitch fibers will never even be activated. So, and we see this clearly. I'm probably getting honestly close to 1 million now at this point of individual muscle fibers we've studied in my lab. And I can say, like, very, very clearly, folks that are highly endurance trained, not only do they have large slow twitch fibers, but their slow twitch fibers are often, if not most of the time, larger than their fast twitch fibers. And so there's very clearly an ability to have a fiber type specific hypertrophy. That's unquestionably documented. You compare that to, again, any form of strength training. Doesn't matter, you're doing triples, 5s, 10s, body skiing. Those are generally going to be more fast twitch driven, and endurance stuff is going to be more slow twitch driven. The question becomes, once you zoom into just strength training, can you do, say, sets of 5 and preferentially hypertrophy the fast twitch fibers, and do sets of 30, say, or 25 or 50, and preferentially target and hypertrophy the slow twitch fibers? So that is the question. And I would say that for 5 or so years, there's been gaining momentum that the answer is yes. However, a paper did come out recently where they failed to find that, but I wouldn't throw that baby out with the bathwater quite yet. And there's a whole host of technical reasons why, but I'll keep it simple and just say that those studies are complicated, and they're more complicated than even those scientists, I believe, realize. When you get to this level of morphology, it's your techniques in your laboratory matter a tremendous amount to your results. And I'm not even speaking to these specific authors of this paper, but there's a lot of people that do muscle physiology research, and they do what we would call, like, not gold standard. I would say they call them like nickel standard, even worse than nickel standard. They're just really bad. So you just be careful until we get the real high polish on that stuff, and we get really, really precise measurements done, and that's done in multiple labs, and we've seen it across multiple communities. Then, and again, this is no slight to those particular studies. I would say the same if I had one study come out from my lab. It's like, well, let's see it demonstrated in other labs. Let's see other people reproduce the findings. Right. And if we all tend to start seeing the same thing, then I'd have more confidence in my own results. Okay, so it's not nothing to do with those folks. But so that's what I'd say is we currently don't know. I think it's going to depend on a lot of factors. So are you doing sets of 5 versus sets of 12? You're doing sets of 5 versus sets of 20? Are you doing sets of 30? What about sets of 50? Like, it's not going to be the same answer with all of them. Is it eccentric only? Is it eccentric and concentric? Is it like all these different variables that can be modified? Well, what were the rest intervals? I think when you change all those variables, you're going to start getting different answers to this question. So I don't think it's as clear as, well, it happens or it doesn't happen. It clearly has an ability to happen, and it clearly has an ability to not make a difference. If you did a set of 5 versus a set of 6, that probably wouldn't cause much difference. So It's a spectrum. Over here, there's no difference. Over here, there clearly is. The question is, where in the middle does it cross over? And you can't, like, that's just going to take a shit ton of studies for us to kind of map that crossover period out.
Right. And so one thing I think a lot of people are interested in is, you know, what is their genetic makeup? Like, what's the actual fiber type distribution that they have? And so I know that they're, you know, we do have the ability to transition. A lot of that has, you know, obviously genetic root, but then also based on environmental factors and our training and stuff like that. So how much of it is, you know, obviously not necessarily like a specific quantification, but generally speaking, how much of that is going to be based on our genetics, and then how much can we actually influence that just through our own lifestyle or training habits and things like that?
So anytime you talk genetics versus lifestyle, so the answer is both, right? It's clearly both. So let's look at how tall you are. Is that driven by lifestyle or genetics? Well, it's both. It's very clearly both, right? If you go suffer through malnutrition, you don't get enough nutrients and enough calories, you will never reach the height of your genetic potential, right? People are getting taller. And we're not really sexually selecting for taller people anymore. It's the fact that we have better nutrition now, so we're getting to there. So you cannot predict and execute a single variable for the most part that is only genetic or only lifestyle driven, especially when you talk like exercise type of things. It's obviously both. Again, the question is how much of each is really determining. So, you know, because examples we get here, like, you know, pick your favorite Usain Bolt, right? Okay, clearly, no matter what you and I do, and you know this analogy, right? So I'm not even going to finish it. You know where that goes. Okay, so that's not the question. The question is, within your own abilities, how much can you change, right? So you're the furthest you could ever push your genetics to the furthest that another person can push them. Those are not fair comparisons. So there's clearly a genetic component. But within yourself, we see basically unlimited plasticity. And what I mean is, given enough time and exposure, you will see basically unlimited changes in your fiber type in any direction. The question becomes, how much time and exposure can you actually put on yourself? So when we look at twin studies, for example, and you see monozygous twins, this means they have the same DNA, like quite literally, right? Not brothers, exactly the same DNA. They're a clone of each other, and they have differences in training for, say, 8 weeks, 10 weeks, 12 weeks. We start to see differences in fiber type. It happens clearly, right? Now you extrapolate that out to the 10-year, 20-year, and then our stuff, the 30-year, 35-year differences. And then we see the differences in fiber type, you know, being from like one twin being 50% fast twitch and 50% slow twitch to the other twin being 95% slow twitch. So I don't know how much more range one would hope for, right? Like it's basically unlimited. The question is, do you have 35 years? Do you have extreme differences? So the more time and the greater variation. So if you had a monozygous twin, and you did nothing, and your monozygous twin did 30% of their 1 rep max for a set of 5 once a month. Well, after 40 years, you're probably not going to be that different because there was a time component there, but there wasn't many exposures. The other end of the spectrum, right? If you twin did absolutely nothing, let's make it extreme. Your twin literally laid in the bed, did not get out of the bed for 5 months, and you lifted for 20 hours a week. Well, after 5 months, you would see dramatic changes in both of you because what the other twin is doing is not stable. They're actually causing a change by being physically inactive while you're going the opposite direction with your activity. So you would see massive differences between you there. So it's hard to give you numbers because numbers don't exist and they don't work in this scenario because it depends on the exposure and time. Both of those factors are incredibly relevant. We also know that nutrition, air pollutants, there's all kinds of things, cold temperature, all of these things influence your fiber type. So again, you can't just be like, well, I did sets of 10 and my brother did sets of 5. Well, are you eating the exact same? Are you sleeping the exact same? Do you live in the same place? Well, all that's going to influence what muscle groups are you talking about. So it's fairly complicated.
When you're looking at like fiber type distribution and something like age or gender, how do these things impact, I guess, the actual distribution? Do we see some sort of a natural change in distribution over time?
Yep, pretty clearly. You're going to lose your fast twitch fibers as you age.
And is that more like a sarcopenia thing, or is that just like that actually happens like, you know, in the 30s and 40s and stuff like that?
Well, what do you mean by sarcopenia? I'm not trying to be pedantic with you, but
No, totally. Yeah.
Some people don't really understand what that term means. So like when you say aging, 30 is is not particularly considered old, nor is 40.
Right. Yeah.
Okay, so sarcopenia doesn't just happen in 7-year-olds either. And so you will start to lose your muscle mass. Usually most folks in the mid to late 30s, they'll start clicking down. That number is increasing. So most folks can even hold on to it in their 40s and 50s, and then it starts to go down. But even, according to the stuff we would do, a 50-year-old would not even be considered old. 55 is middle-aged, right? And so, but they will often start demonstrating reductions in fast twitch fibers at that age. Certainly by the time you get 60, 70, 80, 90, like we've done some studies with 90-plus-year-olds athletes, people that don't stop competing. These are Olympic and world champions in the 1940s and 50s, and they've not stopped competing since, right? So you're talking 60 to almost 70 straight years of competing in various races and things like that. So when I say athletes, I truly mean that. These are 92, 93-year-old, 88, 89-year-old athletes. So what we can see is if you don't use the fast twitch fibers, you're going to lose them. And it's difficult to not use your slow twitch fibers because they are activated for most activities of daily living. So walking, making dinner, things like that. Your fast twitch fibers are only activated during very, very high effort, specifically high resistance type of training. So not conditioning, not endurance type stuff. So if you don't use those, you can imagine over the course of 30 years, eventually those things will go away. The nerve endings there will stop making that connection. The fibers tend to stay there, but you lose the dendrites. So you lose the activation of them. And so those fibers will do a thing called fiber type grouping. They'll come together. But yeah, the loss of fast twitch fibers, in fact, the NIA, the National Institute of Aging, will basically define sarcopenia as the loss of fast twitch fibers. Mm-hmm. The unnecessary losses. Some of that's going to happen with aging. Now, it's not directly what they say, but it's so closely tied. It's almost synonymous to say those two things. So yeah, it's pretty clear that happens with aging. And yeah, in the mid to 30s to 50s, somewhere in that area is when you're going to start losing them. Now, other folks don't. I just tested my vertical jump last week, and it's almost as high as it's ever been. Certainly in my mid 30s, so I'm not like nearing that drop yet. Mm-hmm. So with your activity, you're able to preserve those for quite some time. What we do see is if you look at like the strength records, so if you look at world records in Olympic weightlifting or powerlifting, and you compare that to world records in sprinting, and if you do that across age categories, right? So you have the senior, which would be 18 to 35 or whatever, depending on the sport. Then you have like the 30 to 40 division, 40 to 50, et cetera, et cetera. What you see is speed falls off way faster with aging than strength does. And so it's not that difficult to be 45 years old as a powerlifter and be competing, right? But you would at a pretty high level. Now you're probably not winning world championships, but you could maybe qualify for worlds, or you could get real close, right? You're not that far off. When you look at, say, the 40-yard dash, you would never see or a 100-yard dash, you would never see a 45-year-old in the Olympics for the 100-meter. Not even close, right? They'd get hammered. They're not even going to get in the same stratosphere. When you scale that to weightlifting, it's the same kind of thing, but not to the extent. And that's because there's a much greater speed component in weightlifting than there is in powerlifting, but not nearly the speed component that there is in, say, sprinting or high jumping or anything like that. You can look at sports like the NBA, and people like Vince Carter can play for 20 years because they're high flyers, their first 10, but after that they develop other skills and they don't really jump as much. And so what we know is that fiber type probably predicts speed of movement more than it does strength. And we have demonstrated this in my lab many times. It's not a great proxy for figuring out who's going to be stronger, but it's a pretty good proxy for who's faster. And so when you lose these things, when you don't do speed work, truly fast stuff, that's also probably going to be an issue with you because those fibers that they're really there for, to move speed, to move quickly, are not being used. And you may not even notice it because you're like, oh, I'm strong, 43 is where I've been. Sure, but are you as fast? No, you're way slower. That's not great either. So that's really the foundation of your answer.
That's really interesting. I wasn't aware that fiber type would more so be a predictor of speed not necessarily strength.
They're called fast twitch, not strong twitch.
Right. So that part is intuitive, obviously, but in terms of like being a decent proxy for strength, that part is somewhat surprising to me. I would have assumed that the level of fiber type would definitely.
It is weakly. It's somewhat. So, for example, if I took a random person off the street, then it would be an okay proxy. Okay, but if you want to compare strength to strength, so if you go to world championships, world's strongest man or something like that, and you go biopsy, and we've done this before, fiber type won't predict anything. It won't predict anything among people that are reasonably equally trained for strength. It won't predict anything. If you want to compare people that are super strong and people that are not trained at all, well, then it's going to be a strong correlation, because those people that are untrained have actually lost their fast twitch fibers most likely.
Right.
So it'll predict big things like that, but it won't predict within group at all.
That's interesting. Why do you think that's necessarily the case? Is that just like an individual variance, or?
Well, there's too many ways to create human movement. Fiber type is
Right.
one part of that, but you have mechanics, like you have tendon, you have connective tissue, you have nervous system, you have tactics,
Yeah.
you have strategy, you have technique, you have experience. It's just too many ways at that level, because the margin is, between first and 10th place is 3 or 4%.
Yeah.
Then you can't explain that with one physiological variable.
Totally. No, that makes a lot of sense. That's super interesting. What you said you were actually doing biopsies on World's Strongest Men?
No, we've done them at world championships. We've done some very elite powerlifters, and we did it at world championships for weightlifting a handful of years ago.
That's awesome. That's really cool.
That paper's out. It's free too, open access.
That's really cool. So one thing that I kind of was interested in was the sort of impact that like plyometric training has on fiber type orientation and potentiating strength gains, because plyometrics is one of those things that you hear talked a lot about in West Side and some of the little bit more, I don't want to say fringe conversations, but it's not generally something that you see in a lot of powerlifting programs, but there is a lot of kind of hype about it in research and in its potential for strength and different things like that. And so have you ever seen anyone successfully implement that in either strength training, or do you have any sort of like practical experience with that sort of thing?
Yeah, a tremendous amount. In fact, I think plyometrics are perhaps one of the most underused training modalities of all things. And this is a bigger conversation, but typically what you see happening is powerlifting and bodybuilding dominate the sports science discussion. And so when we talk about training things, it's always assuming you're a powerlifter or a bodybuilder. The vast majority of people that strength train, though, are not in those categories. So all of the discussion about training for athletes, field athletes, those people don't talk for whatever reason. Those people don't have podcasts. They don't go on forums. They get it out there. And so we forget about general strength training principles, because the folks that are trying to get as massively strong or as big as possible are the only ones talking. I'm not saying they're the only ones allowed. They're just, the sport coaches just don't talk, right? And so when you look at things like plyometric, I mean, you kind of said, oh, it's kind of fringe. But if you go to like a track strength conditioning coach, you're like, this is our whole program. What do you mean fringe?
Yeah.
You go to, Jimmy Radcliffe, you're like, what the hell are you talking about? Like, this is how we make players at Oregon the fastest players in college football. It's a huge part of their training. So now, whether or not to use that in a powerlifting program, again, I'm not the right guy to ask that question. I can certainly talk about plyometrics a lot, because the athletes I train use them a ton. And that's because we have to be strong, but what they do for a living, they have to be incredibly explosive, and they have to be able to handle the landing, re-land, things like that, perfect position with their feet on one foot, et cetera, et cetera. They have to be movement, based athletes. Now, one thing that is particularly interesting that I want to plant a flag in is the fact that people also forget and fail to recognize the ability of plyometrics to induce hypertrophy as well. And I think that's fairly clear at this point. People forget about that, and I think it's just something to gain explosiveness with. But you can also gain a reasonable amount of hypertrophy doing that as well. And again, it scales depending on how trained or untrained you are and familiar you are with it. But at the same token, it also causes a tremendous amount of damage. I just had Brian Ortega do this weekend, his first kind of session through there. And he's in very, very good shape, right? He's ready to fight 5-minute rounds right now. He's ready for a world title fight. And he just got wrecked from just a little bit of plyometrics. And so they're very, very damaging, because we're typically not used to moving with that kind of intent. So when we typically do our speed stuff or even our max strength stuff in the weight room, because there's load, the actual executed velocities is very, very low. You compare that to a max broad jump or a triple jump, for max distance with a lot of rest, and you get a whole lot more velocity, and you get a big eccentric component, right? A massive one. And so just going with that actual intent and hitting those velocities when we do our overspeed stuff, when we drag you with the band, instead of, you pulling on a sled where it's slowing you down, we pull you and make you go, at 110% of your maximum velocity. Because this is a very, very, very different type of training. And if you want to get fast, you can add load and slow you down, and that'll help your acceleration, but it won't help your maximum velocity. You do the opposite, like we've done with a number of studies where we put a harness on you and pull you up in the air when you do your vertical jumps instead of pulling you down to the ground. And we see clearly people get a lot better at jumping high when we do that. So we've done the same thing with a baseball swing. You swing a bat faster when you swing a lighter bat, not a heavier one. And so this entire end of the spectrum is typically ignored or non-recognized in a lot of these communities, because getting really fast is not an actual training goal, or they don't really understand it. They want to get like kind of faster, but within their strength side of the spectrum. They don't really understand that whole max true velocity end of the spectrum. So again, I don't know about integrating these things in a powerlifting perspective, but if you want to talk about the science, this end of it, or how I integrate it with our folks, like this is something we do a whole lot, because being really fast is really important when you're trying to kick somebody else in the head or not get kicked in the head.
That's one thing that I've always found was kind of that powerlifting coaches, even myself, like I've definitely been guilty of this as well, where you kind of have this idea of like, this is what training looks like. This is, hypertrophy, and people will talk about things like DUP within the context of powerlifting. And so, a lot of the times I'll hear people being like, DUP is retarded, like don't use it, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, yeah, but like, you're not a season, like you're not an athlete that's playing multiple times per week, maybe, or anything like that, where like you're not necessarily looking to get better, but you kind of want to like just preserve things as much as possible and maybe make some gains maybe in the season. And it's so funny that you don't necessarily think about things like that unless you are, a field sport athlete, like you were saying, or more of like a broadly speaking general strength and conditioning coach. And I think that's really to the detriment of coaches and athletes in powerlifting, because you're really limited in what you're exposed to, right? Like you were saying about plyometrics, about isometrics, or all sorts of different things that, could have a potential, maybe not necessarily directly, but like you were saying, if maybe from like, just randomly throwing it out there, maybe like tendons and ligaments and strengthening and that sort of stuff. You know what I mean? It's like, okay, well, if your tendons are a little stiffer, you're probably not going to get injured as much, or maybe it's going to help with force transmission a little bit better. Maybe pennation angle is going to change a little bit better in your favor, and all sorts of different things. And so that's something that I've started to look into, but it's really like, the more that I look into it, the more I'm like, holy crap, like I'm seeing about this much, and
There's
the more
there's as much there as there is with the strength training stuff.
Yeah.
Right? So all the information you spent 10 years trying to learn about how to just get stronger, but there's as much in the plyometric side too that you haven't seen. So that part of it is just not appreciated. I have an episode in my podcast from the first season where I outline why this exact black hole happens. So this is exactly.
Is that the body and mind? What is it called again?
The body of knowledge.
Body of knowledge. That's right. I got it a while back, but then I think there weren't an episode for a little while, and so
Oh no, we only release like 6 to 8 episodes a year.
Yeah. Okay.
So
I was like, oh, okay.
We spend a lot of time writing each episode and really trying to make them, different and unique. And this is one of the first ones I wanted to get into, is why people see this. So I traced the history of our field a little bit as a method of showing you why the voices have dominated and why the thinking is there. And what people don't even realize is we have blinders on in this field, and that's okay. That's totally fine, as long as you realize that you have blinders on. And if you don't want those blinders on, then you need to take them off and realize there's so many other parts of this field that are not hypertrophy, that are not powerlifting. And I guess no slight to powerlifting, but that's the thing. So just be careful when you're making posts and you're saying things like, oh, never do this, or this style of training sucks, or whatever. It's like,
yeah.
Okay, again, maybe for powerlifting, or maybe for, physique athletes, but what about for a tennis player? What about, and that's the people like, oh, well, I don't work with them. That's not my audience. Well, that's a chicken shit answer. Just say you fucked up and you didn't think about it.
Right.
And you don't, that's not in the front of your mind. That's fine. Those are your blinders. Acknowledge them. Or just come out the gates and be like, look, this post is dedicated to bone, or I'm speaking with the goal of this is probably in mind, then I think this sucks. But we can't generally call these things good or bad training ideas, philosophies, or principles when we haven't considered the vast majority of what people are training for.
No, agreed for sure. Like even something like specificity in powerlifting especially tends to be kind of held up on this pedestal. And I'm not saying it's not important, but at the same time, it's like, okay, who are the strongest athletes out there? I would argue that strongmen are at least equally good at powerlifting as powerlifters, you know?
And they're a whole lot
And
better at strongman.
yeah, and they're just insane athletes. And it's like, okay, well, is their training really specific? I mean, yeah, but it's way less specific than squat, bench, and deadlift. And they all seem to be really good at all of those. So I don't know, you
Well,
know,
you want to make it even worse, just go to the NFL.
those guys are freaks.
If you've
They're
ever been
absolute
around in those
freaks.
weight rooms and you would see what those folks
Yeah,
pull, and you're like, what the hell? With no technique, no training, they have no, and their bodies are beat to living crap, and they can just
yeah,
fire up absolutely absurd numbers. Um, so, I mean, that style
yeah.
of training is pretty good too.
Yeah, when I got into so the reason why I got into Olympic weightlifting first and then eventually powerlifting was um, when I retired from boxing, I had been coaching actually an athlete who he was like a two-time Olympian in bobsleigh, and this guy would do like rebound jumps, like multiple hurdle jumps, and you're talking like 5 feet high, and the guy's like 5'10", like he's not super tall, and he would just be like boom, 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 and I saw that, and it was like it's almost like an optical illusion when you see it. You're like, wait, like I know I saw that, but my brain can't really process what actually happened. And I just thought it was so impressive what he was doing. And it's like, hey, you're not training to be super strong. You're not training to be, any of these things, but you're all of those things. Like that's ridiculous. And yeah, like exactly like what you were saying is, these football athletes who aren't training for any of those things specifically, like that's obviously part of it, but they're training to be better field athletes, first and foremost,
Yeah, it's
and
about asking better questions of what are you training for.
yeah, and
We
they're
don't do a
just
good
these
job of
phenomenal.
asking those questions.
They're absolutely phenomenal athletes who could realistically like either walk onto a bodybuilding stage in a lot of cases and smoke those guys, or walk onto a powerlifting stage and smoke those guys.
Yeah.
And I mean, we've definitely seen that happen where a couple athletes will transition, and all of a sudden you're like, hey, where did this guy come from? Like Ray Williams is a great example. He was a football player, and all of a sudden he's coming out and he's squatting 1,000 for singles like 5 times a week, and you're like, I don't know, like there must be something to that.
Well, we've seen it in the
But
UFC too, right? Like folks come off,
yeah, yeah,
come out of the NFL or a year or two, or kind of in the fringe, and they spend a year or two training in MMA and they're already in UFC and they're top 10 or they get closer or they're competitive, which is because the
just
athleticism is
insane.
so insanely high.
Yeah. So we're coming up on that hour mark, and I want to be respectful of your time. So what's one opinion you have that sort of either goes against the grain, or you don't necessarily have any research to substantiate it at this point, or maybe the mechanisms aren't entirely understood, but it's something that you've seen from a practical experience standpoint that you feel confident, at least in the moment, saying, you know what, I do believe this to be true. We'll see why it's the case later on.
I've been on record for over 10 years saying the same thing for this question. I'm a full believer that hyperplasia is reasonably normal, somewhat common cause or result of strength training. So if you're unfamiliar with that term, that simply means we typically say that hyperplasia doesn't happen in humans. Hyperplasia being the growth of new muscle fibers. So typically we say that you get hypertrophy, so your muscle gets larger, either one of two ways. You grow new fibers or the fibers you have get larger. And we have yet to document hyperplasia happening. And so the assumption is it's all hypertrophy that's causing whole muscle hypertrophy from the single fiber size. But I think we have enough evidence now, and we've seen it in so many other animals. In fact, it is fairly clearly documented. The questions that remain are, what are the situation and circumstances that have to happen for us to see this in humans as a part of normal training, right? So we could do all kinds of crazy extreme models and see it, but is it something that happens in 6 weeks? Probably not. 6 months? Don't even know about that. But after years of training, I think that we start to see that happening. So we have a lot of, like I said, we have a lot of missing information there, but I do think that eventually we're going to figure out, yeah, this does happen. It's not a zero. It's not half of your hypertrophy or even close, but it is some measurable percentage. And that's not
Mhm.
nominal.
Where can the listeners find find you on social media?
Yeah, like I said, we haven't released an episode of our podcast in a long time. I don't even know when we will, but the first 3 seasons are up. The Body Knowledge. You can go back and binge all those if you'd like. The YouTube. So I put up basically all of my, especially with Corona going on right now, that we're teaching from home for the foreseeable future. And so I just put all my classes on YouTube. So all of my strength training classes, program design, muscle physiology, nutrition, all that stuff is all up on my YouTube page, just 100% for free. No newsletters or anything to sign up for. It's all up there. And of course, social media, Twitter and Instagram are the best for me.
Awesome. So all those links are going to be in the show notes. Andy, thanks so much for coming on the episode. It was really awesome to chat. I've been following your stuff for a long time, like I said, and so it's cool to kind of chat face to face and just get some of your insights on some of these things that are a little bit less talked about, let's say, in the powerlifting community.
Sounds good, man. Hope you guys enjoyed that.
Thanks. Take care, man.
See ya.
Hey guys, thanks so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed the episode and took a lot from it that you can apply to your own situation to see much better results. I just have one quick personal favor to ask of you. Please make sure you subscribe and leave me a 5-star rating on whatever podcast platform you're using. When you do this, it helps me get better at producing content and increases my exposure so I can continue putting out high quality information for you guys. Next, I want to extend a personal invitation to shoot me a DM on Instagram at Stacked Strength. I'll help you troubleshoot anything you need. This is literally an invitation to connect with me directly, so make sure you head on over and jump into my DMs. All right, guys, thanks so much for listening, and I'll see you next time.